Hi guys, welcome to chapter 7, which is understanding and auditing internal controls. We start off this chapter with a very brief history of internal controls for public companies. And this is going to echo a little bit of the stuff that was at the beginning of chapter 6, but go into a bit more detail. This is going into the background of where the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations came from. Hopefully you remember the word COSO because they are the ones who created the COSO framework that we learned about in chapter 6. Basically what happened was back in the 1970s, there was a lot of corruption, so lots of corruption in campaign finance. There was some financial statement fraud. There was bribery. And there was also, in the late 70s and early 80s, a series of reforms was seen. So things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was passed in the late 70s, and campaign finance reforms were passed. And so one of the other things that occurred was the Treadway Commission was formed. And this was formed in 85. And one of the first initiatives that they did was they investigated why fraud occurred and did some surveying. And basically what they found was this, right? And this particular survey here was relatively recent, done in the last 5 years. But basically what they found back then in the 80s was the same thing that we find today, which is essentially fraud occurs because of poor internal controls. It's sort of the same thing over and over again. History tends to repeat itself. So what they found back then was the main determinant of fraud is low quality internal controls. In other words, that opportunity leg of the fraud triangle is wide open. So there's plenty of opportunity there. And so what they sought to do was come up with this internal control framework, or COSO framework. So they put together this Committee of Sponsoring Organizations in 87, and then the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations worked and they put out the first COSO framework in 1992. And like we've said in chapter 6, the idea behind the COSO framework was, hey, this is kind of a conceptual framework as to how your internal control system should be organized, the basic components that it should have, the basic principles that should be underlying it. And if all these things are in place, you will have a pretty solid system of internal controls that hopefully it won't be completely impenetrable by fraud, but it will be, relatively good. So keep in mind, right, they released their first COSO framework in 1992. But at this point, it is entirely voluntary whether or not companies want to take internal controls seriously, whether they want to adopt the COSO framework. So a lot of companies don't take it seriously. They don't adopt internal controls because, quite frankly, it's quite costly to put corporate governance systems in place. It's costly to document what types of controls are going on in the organization, and it's tedious to test internal controls as well. So a lot of companies don't necessarily want to do it. It's not something that's high on their priorities list. It's not something that's like sexy or exciting. So yeah, wasn't high on most companies' to-do lists. But then there continued to be lots of cases of fraud, lots of big splashy front page newspaper headline cases of fraud, which continued. And we know, of course, that we had a lot in the late 90s and early 2000s, particularly Enron, WorldCom, and ultimately the failure of Arthur Andersen. And all of this leads up to SOX, which we've said before was kind of this reactionary legislation to all these scandals that kind of occurred all around the same time. And the thing about SOX is, at this point, people had known essentially for decades, right, that the main cause of these frauds was poor internal controls. And they'd had, a pretty good system in place. They basically said, okay, here's the framework, the COSA framework that you should adopt if you want to prevent fraud. But nobody had really cared or paid attention, right? They'd said, we don't really feel like adopting internal controls, so no thanks. And the frauds continued to happen. So this is kind of the frame of mind that the regulators were in when they were putting out SOX. They're kind of like, okay, you don't want to adopt internal controls voluntarily? Well, then we'll have to just shove them down your throat and make it all mandatory, because clearly, nobody is taking internal controls seriously. So that is essentially what one of the big components of SOX did, is it forced internal controls kind of down the throats of not only companies, but also down the throats of the auditors of these companies. And it also makes the companies have to disclose to their investors how high quality those internal controls are. Now, the auditor has to audit the internal controls for registrants over a certain size. Everything has to be documented now. So it was considered very, very extreme legislation at the time, because before that, everything had been voluntary. But the regulators had absolutely kind of reached the last straw after years of companies and auditors and so on not taking internal controls seriously. So these are some of the most important provisions of SOX in terms of enhancing the requirements related to internal controls. So the first that we want to talk about is Section 302. So this added management quarterly certifications to the financial statements. And this is really something you'll typically see as an attachment to the Form 10Q in the quarterly certifications. The signing officers, which this is generally going to be, when it says signing officers, it's generally going to be the CEO and the CFO. It's basically them signing off on a statement saying, hey, we accept responsibility for internal controls and the quality of internal controls, and we're kind of certifying the idea that they have been effective over the past 90 days. And if there have been any deficiencies in internal controls or big changes in internal controls over the last 90 days, those will be noted in the certification. And I have an example here from Apple of the quarterly certification. So you can see it's being signed down here by Tim Cook. And you can see up at the top, he's saying, I, Tim Cook, certify that he's reviewed the 10Q and that the other certifying officers and I are responsible for establishing all these internal controls over financial reporting. They've evaluated their effectiveness. They're making sure they've disclosed significant deficiencies and material weaknesses. So that would be here where it's saying they have to disclose the internal control deficiencies. So you can see all these things are referenced here. If you want to see where it is in the 10Q, this is the little link here, so you can go actually look at it on the SEC Edgar website. So that is the quarterly certification. The next part of SOX that enhanced the requirements related to internal controls was Section 404A. All right, so this was management's annual assessment related to internal controls over financial reporting and their effectiveness. So this essentially is every year as part of the 10K, management has to include a report which tells whether or not the internal controls over financial reporting, or ICFR, and I'm going to say that ICFR about 100 times today, so just get used to it, that it means internal controls over financial reporting. So remember, this is distinct from internal controls over operations and compliance. Because remember, there are the three types of controls: operations, compliance, and financial reporting. So all these requirements, like the 404A and the 404B requirements, which are the ones we're going to be talking about the most today, they are just over ICFR, internal controls of financial reporting, and they're not concerned with the controls over operations or the controls over compliance. So yeah, once a year they have to issue this report saying whether or not they find their ICFR controls to be effective. The key thing is the 404A report is management's report. All right, and we're going to talk in a minute about the 404B report, which is the auditor's report over ICFR. And another key thing to keep in mind for the 404A report is it is as of a point in time, which basically means that they're really giving their opinion as to whether or not the controls are effective as of the end of the fiscal year. So we can say a date like 12/31/19. So they're saying whether or not the controls are effective as of this date, not whether they've been effective from 1/1/19 through 12/31/19. So what that technically means is it is possible that for the first 6 months of the year, 7 months of the year, controls could be ineffective and they could still give a nice clean 404A opinion saying my controls are effective as of 12/31/19. We'll talk more about this as we go on, because it's the same case for the auditor's 404B opinion. It is also as of a point in time. So a little more about the 404A report. So as part of the 404A report, they have to say they're responsible for ICFR's effectiveness. So think of this as similar to the financial statements, right? So management's responsible for the content of the financial statements, for the fairness of the financial statements, just as management is responsible for the effectiveness of ICFR. If a company is under 404A, which it will be as long as it is public, they also have to evaluate the effectiveness of their ICFR using suitable control criteria. So what does suitable control criteria mean? Typically for companies in the US, it is the COSO framework. And they have to have, documentation evidence that supports their evaluation, which basically means when they're going through and doing all their tests, they need to keep all the documentation so that they can prove they did it. So very similar to what the auditor does when they're testing controls, right? It's a similar kind of concept of if you didn't document it, you didn't do it. And then at the end, present a written assessment, which is going to kind of be in the form of this 404A report in the 10K. And next up is section 404B, which I've kind of been referencing already. All right, so section 404B of SOX says an external auditor has to give an opinion on the effectiveness of ICFR. So we're essentially at this point auditing management's assertion about effectiveness of ICFR. And again, we're giving this opinion as of a point in time, which is fiscal year end. Again, just keep in mind this idea that what this means is it is possible for your controls to be ineffective for a really good chunk of the year. And then as long as they are effective as of this fiscal year end date, you can give a clean opinion saying they're effective in the 10K, right? And nobody has to know that the first 6 months of the year, these controls sucked. And when you have a company that is subject to 404B that you're auditing, you're going to be conducting an integrated audit, so-called. So when you're doing an integrated audit, well, all that means is you are doing both an audit of ICFR and an audit of the financial statements. Basically, what this point is saying here is you're doing both of these audits simultaneously, and each of those audits will kind of give you information about the other. So if I am doing my internal control audit and I find out controls over AP sucks, that tells me when I'm doing my financial statement audit, right, I need to do a lot more substantive procedures over accounts payable because I don't really trust the accounts payable balance because I know there's bad controls. It's kind of that whole garbage in, garbage out concept. On the other hand, how can my financial statement audit inform me about my ICFR audit? Well, if I am testing controls over AP, because of potential sampling error, it's possible that I test controls over AP and I think they're all effective just because I pulled a bad sample, when actually maybe some of those controls aren't working so great, right? We sort of talked earlier about the concept of a non-representative sample. So I pull a bad sample, it tells me all my controls are working perfectly, when in fact, in truth, maybe they're not working out so great. But then when I actually go on and perform my audit of accounts payable, maybe I find a material misstatement in my AP balance. If I find a material misstatement in my AP balance, what that tells me is that somewhere along the way, a control failed to prevent or detect that material misstatement. So it's kind of like the material misstatement itself is proof that a control was bad somewhere in the process. So my financial statement audit then can inform me about the state of internal controls. This lovely little slide summarizes who is required to comply with what and which of these requirements in terms of public companies. And it also tells me when they were required to comply. For SOX 302 quarterly certifications, if you were a public company, you were required to comply regardless of size immediately, right? As soon as SOX was passed. For SOX 404A, again, all public companies are required to comply. However, if you're an accelerated filer, which an accelerated filer versus a non-accelerated filer, the delineation there is the size of your public float. Public float is roughly equal to market cap, which is shares outstanding times share price. So if your public float is greater than 75 million as a company, you are classified as an accelerated filer. If it's under 75 million, you're a non-accelerated filer. So basically, they're kind of splitting up the companies by size. So for Section 404A, today everyone is doing it if they're a public company. But originally, when SOX was passed, the accelerated filers had to adopt Section 404A right away, which the first compliance year was 2004. They also had to adopt Section 404B right away. So again, first compliance year for that was 2004. For Section 404A, for the non-accelerated guys, they did not have to adopt that until 11/15/07 for fiscal years starting on or after 11/15/07. And for Section 404B, initially it was something very similar where they were going to have to adopt it, but on a delayed basis. But then these little guys kept lobbying and saying, oh, it's going to be such a hardship, such a burden for us to adopt 404B. It's so expensive. And so they kept delaying it. And then eventually in 2010, as part of Dodd-Frank, they were permanently exempted from having to ever adopt 404B. So these little firms, the non-accelerated filers, do not have to do Section 404B, but they are still required to do Section 404A. All right, and because of this is why back in those prior chapters, when we had those decision trees where it said, this stage you decide whether or not controls are effective, right? And this should drive your decision as to whether or not you test controls and take the reliance approach or the substantive approach. And it had that comment about how in public companies, the answer is always to go with the reliance approach. You always have to test controls. So the reason why, and we kind of talked about this, the reason why you always have to test controls in a public company is because you always have to give an opinion on controls in a public company. And it's actually not really public companies in general, it is accelerated filers specifically. So for these guys, because I have to give the ICFR opinion, it will always be performing a test of controls. So remember, even if you think control risk is going to be high, even if you believe 100% that all the controls are going to fail, that you will have to make up for it with substantive testing, you still have to go through the motions and the routine of testing all those controls and watching them fail and documenting it. And it's because we have to give the opinion on ICFR. So it's not good enough to just say, if we're actually giving an opinion on it and getting paid to give an opinion on it, we can't just say, oh, well, we thought they were going to fail, so we decided not to test them, right? We have to actually test them and observe the failure. So now I have a quick example of 404A and 404B reports, which again are attachments to the 10K, and these are from Apple's 10K filing. So if you want to look at them, the link is here. So this is the 404A report. You can see it talks about how management conducted an assessment of effectiveness of ICFR, and it talks about the framework used, right? It's based on the criteria issued by COSO. And we also see mention of the as of date. So this is Apple's fiscal year end for that particular year. There's this sort of weird, it changes every year. It's something like the fourth Saturday in September, but that was their fiscal year end in 2018. And then it references that they also have to have EY do their 404B opinion, right? And this is the 404B opinion from EY. Okay? And so you see again, they've audited Apple's ICFR as of fiscal year end based on the criteria, aka the COSO criteria. And again, they're talking about the as of date. And what's interesting too, if you pause the video for a minute and read through this opinion, is you'll notice how much the language of this ICFR opinion really mirrors the language of all the financial statement opinions that we read through. So it's very, very similar. So for instance, you'll see it talks about how management's responsibilities versus the auditor's responsibilities, right? It's like management's responsible for maintaining effective ICFR. Our responsibility is to express an opinion on ICFR, right? And again, it's like, gotta talk about the fact that it's reasonable assurance, not absolute assurance. We don't want people thinking we're providing absolute assurance